Well, it's the same question as, can a project fail, but people say it was a success. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is the operation was a success, the patient died. There's a lot of projects and programs that I've seen where literally success has been defined as brute force. We got it across the line. Yeah. Not actually, didn't realize the outcome that we intended.
How should organizations define value? Because many of them measure the success of AI through speed, automation, and cost reduction. What does genuine business value from AI look like beyond those immediate efficiency gains?
I think if organizations just focus on AI as a productivity tool or an accelerator, so to speak, then they're not actually thinking about how AI can be a catalyst for how value is created organizationally.
Who becomes accountable when parts of the workflow are handled autonomously?
You're standing in court and the judge says to you, who made that decision? And you go, well, it wasn't me, it was AI. And they go, yeah, that's fine, but you're still accountable. So you own the outcome and absolve themselves of any responsibility because AI told them so. That is cognitive surrender.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of The Founder's Instinct. I'm your host Shaheer Khan. Today's conversation is about moving beyond the excitement surrounding AI and asking a more important question. How can organizations use it in a way that creates real business value, earns trust, and leads to lasting change? We'll also be discussing why transformation projects often run into trouble before execution even starts, what genuine value from AI looks like, and how organizations can adopt new technology without weakening human judgment or accountability. Our guest today has spent his career working across technology, consulting, transformation, and governance. He now helps organizations make better decisions before major programs begin and remain focused on value throughout delivery. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Richard Sharp, co-founder and director of Arqvera. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I am well, thank you. Thank you, Shaheer.
Okay, Richard, before we begin, I'd like to start with your journey, your early career in technology and transformation, how you became involved in building Arqvera, and how those experiences shaped your current views on AI and the business value around it.
There's a lot in that question. I've spent more than 25 years helping companies and organizations deliver technology-enabled change. So my early career started actually in design. So you can probably see in the background, although it's a bit fuzzy, it's a very creative space. I've got easels and paints and whatnot. So I am an artist at heart. But I moved from design to digital in the 90s pretty quickly. In the 90s, the internet revolution and the dot-com boom was an exciting time, and it felt like the Wild West. I've got to say now, with AI, it feels like the Wild West on steroids. But if I go back, so my career essentially was started in design, moved into digital, moved into software development and software engineering, moved into business development, so stepped out of kind of hands-on code and actually building business. And then ultimately in the last 15 odd years has really been around enterprise transformation and then delivering consulting leadership. So I've been fortunate enough to live around the world. I'm Australian. I was born in Australia, but I was raised around the world, and that then followed my career as well. So I've lived in, lived and worked in the UK, US, Europe. So I lived in France for a spell, and I'm currently living in the UK. So, I've worked with public sector bodies. I've worked with SMB and SMEs, and I've worked with enterprise, global enterprises as well. And effectively, that's always really been focused around, cloud platforms, major transformation projects and programs, and really the difficulty of changing, or not changing, but turning an investment into value.
Yeah.
So what I kind of have seen is that technology is rarely the problem or the thing that actually determines whether a project or a transformation effort fails or it succeeds. So the reality is organizations out there can access the same platforms, the same skills and capabilities, the same implementation partners, the same methodologies. So basically everyone's kind of selling the same thing, sometimes repackaged as different names. But what really interests me is why do some projects actually create disproportionate value, but some just don't? And I worked for Kodak for a spell And that, back in the mid 2000s, just as it was kind of going, ho, digital cameras, our whole business model's being threatened. And that was really interesting because there were some really excellent people, but they were caught in something bigger than them. And that's always been in the back of my mind is, people and capability. So really that meant, as I kind of evolved my career, I became actually less interested in the technology and more interested in kind of the human side of change and actually why is it treated as just this kind of afterthought? Everyone's focused on the technology, but not actually focused on the people. So ultimately, those questions really kind of led to me building Arqvera with three partners, across the US and the UK. I've worked with them for a number of years, very trusted, and we wanted to build something different. And even down to the name, Arqvera actually, a lot of thought went into it, and it means the architecture of trust. So,
Okay.
arc and questions. We need to ask questions, right? So that's why it's Q. And Vera is Latin for truth. So, we're trying to deliberately, position ourselves very differently from the traditional SI or the traditional kind of consulting advisory firm. So because we're all, senior practitioners, we've seen it all. We've, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, the same things are done all the time. It's always generally kind of based in this kind of optimism bias of that won't happen to us, even though the data and the research is pretty compelling, out there. And, the reality is, having been client side, supply side, vendor side, the answer is yes, it will. Yes, it will happen to you. It is absolutely likely it will. So Arqvera's focus is really helping, organizations make better decisions before the actual major commitment is made. So we want to make sure that we're building confidence in delivery, but also making sure that the value that was predicted in the business case is actually realized afterwards. So essentially we focus end to end from the beginning of inception, the idea, all the way through to realization. And I'll give you a quick view here. I'm a member of the Service Delivery Alliance, which covers Europe and America in particular. And some research was done that basically found that ISVs who are members, from Zendesk, big companies like Zendesk all the way down to small ISVs, the typical implementation time for a project would be on average probably about 6 months. The discovery time or the inception time, probably likely about 6 months. And then realization time, 6 months. So you're looking at between 18 months to 2 years between the idea to actually now the outcome. That's a lot of time. There's a lot of time between those, that kind of paradigm. So ultimately what that means is, and in particular in the world of AI, is it's actually accelerated and made it way more important. So what we're kind of seeing right now is most of the conversations are starting as me too. We need to do something with AI. That's a technology discussion. What I kind of think is, rather than talking about models and agents and automation and what costs can we strip out, the more strategic question for me is what changes your organization, if AI affects your operating model, your economics, the leadership needs, the governance needs, the workforce capability, all that kind of stuff is, your competitive advantage. That's really important. Like really, really important, because if you're not having those conversations that actually understand at a strategic level how AI could affect your business, you're just having a technocentric discussion that's going to deliver incremental value at best. And that's why we kind of really frame, our company, we frame AI as less of a technology thing and more of actually a business model governance, human transformation, value realization challenge. That's it. That's for us.
Yeah, that's really an interesting journey. And also because I'm an artist at heart as well. I paint, and I paint less now, but I still do. And also because your perspective has clearly been shaped by seeing transformation from several sides, not only technology, but also strategy, delivery, people, and governance. And that makes the idea much more clearer. So let's talk about the main ideas behind Arqvera. As Arqvera is built around the idea that projects often don't suddenly fail during delivery, the conditions for failures usually created much earlier. So, what are organizations getting wrong before execution even begins?
There's rarely a big bang moment where you go, right, it's failed. The symptoms and the visible problems generally appear throughout delivery, and the conditions for failure, I believe, and actually, I'll come back to this in a second, but actually, the conditions are set up a lot earlier, and that's generally because organizations haven't aligned around what success really means. So there's a guy called Professor Bent Flyberg who wrote the book How Big Things Get Done, and his research has, pretty much come up with the same kind of concept, is that effectively, you've got to think slow to move fast, right? And what generally happens, in my experience, in all these countries around the world, is leaders are under pressure. They move quickly to solution. They move to solution before the business outcomes have really been made kind of explicit. And why do they do that? They take a technocentric view, in my opinion, because actually it's tangible. The vendors are showing them the art of the possible. They're kind of wooing them with all this information. It's tangible. The activity feels like it's productivity, but actually it's not productivity because there's no real value attached yet. So ultimately, there's also another problem that I kind of see and I call it the kind of triangle. The buyer generally wants to realize a capability or an outcome, right? At best an outcome. The systems implementer, if it's a large scale transformation, the systems implementer is generally just wanting to sell their bench. That's how they monetize. And the vendor is trying to sell seats. That's how they monetize. So the drivers are completely different in that triangle. And ultimately, if the customer or the organization is not acutely aware of that dynamic and actually how it can create conflicts, they tend to get led down what we'll call a garden path, where the vendor might be, saying, this is what you got to do, this is what you got to do. And they end up with, and this is a lot of organizations have experienced this, licenses that just sit there dead. They don't actually get used. And now we're actually moving into, because of AI and data consumption in particular, a consumption-based pricing model. And I look at that and go, right, okay, this is a really interesting time, because as a CFO, I'd want to know the forecast of what my license costs are going to be. But if it's consumption, you're in scenario territory now, not utilization, territory where it's like, oh, well, I'm paying for 1,000 seats and X plus Y equals Z, and I know what it costs. Now it's, well, if you use it this way or that way, and if you're using these models and it becomes a lot more complex. So, ultimately, it's just really easy for the buyer to slip into technology rather than actually thinking about what business problem or business opportunity am I actually trying to realize. Then you've got, I guess, we're human, right? We're speaking English at the moment, but we will interpret words differently. So, that then essentially means that assumptions on value, risk, scope, budget, et cetera, can be variable, because we are human beings. When you have international teams, that becomes even more acute, because you've got not only language barriers, but also cultural differences. So, there's so many dynamics at play. So, it also, one of the other things that I kind of see is your organizational readiness is not really even thought of. It's just slam it in, right? And essentially, what that actually then kind of ends up being, and, this is something I've seen repeatedly, is effectively the consequences, the delivery teams, whether it's, internal, supply side, whatever the kind of structure is, they inherit this ambiguity that they then have to reinterpret and replay back, and then, go through that journey where effectively, if it wasn't shaped very well at the beginning, it could just be an absolute, tough journey where effectively delivery becomes brute force. Just drive it in. And there's a lot of projects and programs that I've seen where literally success has been defined as brute force. We got it across the line.
Yeah.
Not actually didn't realize the outcome that we intended.
You talked about leaders jumping to solutions as soon as they see a problem. So how much of the risk comes from the ownership or different stakeholders expecting different outcomes?
It really depends. I think that ultimately, it will come down to governance, right? And effectively, what we're dealing with in that situation is uncertainty. right? And effectively, you need to make that uncertainty. You're never going to get it 100%. I mean, I'm the first one to say you never.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what you've got is crystal ball, and none of us can read the future and tell the future. But ultimately, you can actually try and reduce uncertainty as much as possible, and they are actually about testing assumptions. They are about clarifying decision rights. Who holds the ultimate decision, who holds the ultimate, accountability. So what I'm talking about there is governance. Assessing the readiness and actually understanding the benefits case via establishing governance that supports execution, so that effectively it's not kind of stood up during execution. And that's probably the most important thing. Is what you'll generally find, particularly with technology transformation or technology projects, is governance gets stood up after the statement of work has been signed by the customer rather than stood up before. And then you'll have a variable whereby if, the company, the buyer might actually have fairly strong governance, for argument's sake, they might actually have a good program manager or program director. They've created a governance structure that kind of works quite well. But then they'll have, a supplier held at arm's distance and not brought into decision making, because it's like, oh, no, they're not part of the team. They're just a supplier. I've never really kind of held to that idea. It's for me, it's more of a mutually assured success or mutually assured destruction kind of model. You want to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
So ultimately, really, where does confidence come from? It comes from making sure that people are aligned, and make sure that people actually explain the problem or the opportunity or whatever it is, using the same language, but when tested, in terms of do they really understand, 5 whys, for argument's sake, why, they give you the straight answer from their language rather than the corporate spiel. And that I think is really important. The other thing is, and this is a bit of a segue, is in the SME world, the mid-market, do not have people working business as usual whilst also trying to deliver a project or a program. It's a recipe for success. A recipe for disaster. Sorry, my bad. The wrong word. Recipe for disaster, because effectively, if you want to understand the culture and behaviors, look at the metrics, how people are measured. And if they're measured BAU, that's how they get paid. Maybe there's a bonus structure to it. And they've got this thing on the side called a project. Well, you know where the weight's going to go.
Yeah. And you talked about reducing uncertainty. So what kind of warning signs should those leaders look for before approving a project?
There's a real simple answer to that.
Yeah.
We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
That's a real simple answer. If I hear that, and I have heard that so many times, we don't know what we don't know, then that is the warning sign that the buyer or the customer who owns the outcome, mind you, they're not certain. That they've got a high degree of uncertainty.
Yeah, but they can see similar patterns in future projects. So what kind of patterns do you think they should look for?
Patterns in future projects of uncertainty.
Yeah. A project that failed earlier, it shows the same kind of pattern in the future project. So should they look for patterns?
It's a really good question. It's a really, really good question. Looking for patterns of uncertainty. I think that, ultimately, if decision making is based on a business case that effectively outlines, the rationale to buy technology and then implement it, but doesn't actually go into understanding humans, the readiness of that organization to change, that is a clear sign that there's going to be a problem in the future. If effectively it's handled as just a straight procurement exercise, whereby we're just buying the cheapest supply of pair of hands, to do something for us, that's a clear warning. If there is a lack of accountability at the top, clear warning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Richard, my next question is that how should organizations define value? Because many of them measure the success of AI through speed, automation, and cost reduction. What does genuine business value from AI look like beyond those immediate efficiency gains?
So efficiency is important. I mean, it is really important, but so it's not don't want to dismiss it. But, so yes, okay, AI can help reduce manual effort. It can improve, speed, lower cost to serve, lower the cost of routine work. Yes. But I think if organizations just focus on AI as a productivity tool or an accelerator, so to speak, then they're not actually thinking about how AI can be a catalyst for how value is created organizationally. So I guess being a bit creative, I tend to kind of think more kind of wider and more holistic, blue sky thinking, well, what if AI can improve the quality and the consistency of decision making, and that means employees spend a lot less time on routine work. What are they going to do, right? What's the next thing that they might do? It to me, that's kind of like, okay, there's an opportunity and a threat there, right? The opportunity is to rethink effectively the business model and rethink services, rethink, how value, customer experience is derived, or how, to personalize services more, get closer to the customer, right? Rather than just keeping it at arm's distance. So I think, AI presents some really interesting opportunities there. I have seen cases. I saw one recently. I won't say who it was, but it was for vulnerable people, at-risk people, and it was an AI chatbot, and it was so the wrong use case. For at-risk vulnerable people, you don't want them, being triaged or going through a chatbot. You want them talking to a human being. So that was. I think some organizations are just kind of thinking, oh, let's just apply technology and kind of see what we can come up with, rather than actually thinking, I guess, a little bit more holistically. I also don't think that AI, just as an immediate it'll transform into value. It'll affect the bottom line. In fact, McKinsey did some research recently that was like, I think it was like 6% of AI projects have actually positively affected the bottom line. So we're still in the really early days. But there's one thing for me that is actually really clear, is that in some sectors, AI will drastically affect the value chain of cognitive work. And what that'll then mean is essentially the business itself is then potentially challenged, because effectively your barriers to entry might reduce, your cost and pricing models might have to change, your service models might have to change, workforce structures might have to change, the way you compete might have to change. And that's not about efficiency. That is a fundamentally structural conversation, and the strategic conversation. So we've, Arqvera, we've developed something called the business model stress test that tests, it's for the private equity market in particular, but it tests portfolio and the value creation plans within the portfolio for private equity companies against 3 different futures and against 5 different categories, to come up with, does the VCP hold, bend, or break? Against these 3 different scenarios. And the way I kind of would frame it is, the entry level scenario is just, okay, AI is kind of marginally improved productivity and there's not much of a change. Whereas the top end is fundamentally, it is, there's mass unemployment. There is, huge kind of structural change in economies, so forth and so on. And it's a really important, tool for particularly private equity companies to be able to kind of just at least, it's not crystal ball, because none of us have that, but to be able to look at this from a scenario planning perspective and actually come up with mitigation strategies, should the signs actually start to indicate in the future which pathway it might go down. So ultimately, it's like, if it's not just about efficiency, if it's actually just about bigger concepts about, how AI might fundamentally change things in the future, your thinking starts to elevate in a very different direction. And I think organizations really need to have those conversations. First one, I will admit, the first conversation for an organization looking at AI is, what is AI? Why would I even look at it? But if you have work that is process-based, that is about analysis and synthesis of information, recognizing patterns in disparate data, that's a use case, to at least get started in this conversation, or this journey, should I say.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of phrase it like this, is that we are living through the greatest social experiment in human history. And that's pretty scary, but also pretty exciting, at the same time. So hence why, if you're talking about the founder's instinct per se, with all risk, there's great opportunity. With all downside, there are upsides. So, get into it. Have a go.
Yeah, I completely agree with your perspective. And you talked about the AI chatbots, and how a vulnerable person should be communicating to a human with a human, not a chatbot, which was actually my next question. Like, can an AI project appear successful from a technical standpoint, but still fail commercially or operationally?
Well, it's the same question as, can a project fail, but people say it was a
Yeah.
success? I mean, one of my favorite sayings is, the operation was a success, the patient died. It depends on your perspective, right? So one of the principles in founding Arqvera is that we would be human centered, and we would try and coach senior leaders through the journey and not look at it as a cost reduction exercise, which has a cost for people and also for society. I've got two university age children at the moment. My oldest has just finished his Bachelor of Finance and Economics at Cardiff University, and I can see that the number of graduate programs has significantly reduced because a lot of the graduate program suppliers, i.e. the top end of town enterprise companies, are throttling back graduate recruitment. Now, so I'm living that with my son, and it's not fun. So, Arqvera, we're really trying to take a more principled approach and actually lead organizations through all the noise of all the low hanging fruit, and the noise of the opportunity and the low hanging fruit of, I can optimize my cost base and I can get a really good short term, bump in performance. But I think the long term cost will be much higher if we all take that view. So, I'm looking at it and going, well, I want to help, and we want to help organizations redesign work more intelligently, and really with this view of where humans need to be within a process or a value chain across different functions, and where AI can generally extend that human capability, right? So think about it like this. I'm a Trekkie, right? I love Star Trek. Star Trek has, the greatest AI, computer, do this, do that. Everyone's like PhD level in Star Trek. So I've got this belief that actually, if we do it right, AI can actually elevate our intelligence. But I also recognize that for some sectors and for some people, it might also increase what I kind of call a cognitive surrender, which is, I'll just do what the machine told me to do. So I would just absolve my thinking to the machine. And that's dangerous. That's really dangerous. So I look at it and think, well, what are we good at? What are humans good at? We are good at dealing with ambiguity. We're good at creativity. We're good at, negotiating with people, right? AI can't do that. Even if we kind of meld what China's doing with robots with what, the US is doing with AI, and kind of go, well, in the future, there'll be robots that'll be as intelligent. They're not going to have empathy, which is massive. It might be programmed empathy, but it's not going to be real empathy. And humans need that. And humans need that to be able to trust. Stephen Covey, for instance, one of, his 7 habits has always stuck with me, which is investing in the emotional bank account. How can AI can't do that? Humans can. Humans can withdraw too. So I just look at it and think, well, ultimately it becomes kind of a design question of how an organization wants to work. What matters from the human side and what matters from the machine side. And if the machine side is really just getting us out of effectively moving from like the abacus to the spreadsheet to now AI, accountants have gone through that journey over hundreds of years. It's the same kind of conversation. Accountants will still be accountants, but their work will be different.
Yep. You have a strong emphasis on human-centered transformation, and you basically covered most of what I was going to ask. Now, my question is that how should leaders communicate AI adoption so employees see it as a support rather than a threat?
Okay. Yeah. So like I said, AI is effectively the Wild West on steroids. Resistance is futile. Sorry, the Trekkie coming out of me. No. Resistance is present. Take AI out of it and put in cloud application or two companies merged. You'll have resistance, right? It's that's the human side. It's generally they're resisting because they not because they dislike the change. Might manifest that way, but it's something deeper, and it's more often they're protecting themselves from something, right? And it's status, competence, certainty, autonomy, belonging, sense of fairness. It's intrinsic, and that is what gets missed. And that from an AI perspective, that's where I actually think that organizations really need to think deeper, because yes, AI will touch on all of those those levers of human psyche. So yeah, it does require more than kind of just going, okay, let's just deploy something and hope for the best. You might have been able to do that with a CRM, and people will kind of marginally adopt it and adopt the sales process for argument's sake. But with AI, I think it's fundamentally different. So I think that really we need, again, we're kind of coming back to the organizational kind of design, the culture, behaviors, so forth and so on. These need to be thought about, but also what it means to be a professional in that world. No one wants to be in a situation where they feel like an idiot in front of their peers. Like no one, from the CEO all the way down to someone, at an entry level. No one wants that. So, you can't just impose that. You need to go through that journey and realizing that people learn in different ways and that change is not linear. So that's why, look, I love Prosky Adkar and Cotter and Kubler-Ross and Lewin and a whole bunch of other, procedural kind of process change management frameworks. They're great, but change is not linear. People are not linear. We go backwards, forwards, up and down, and, things happen. And I like the idea, personally, I like the idea of actually recognizing that people learn in different ways. And actually, people learn by exposure to new things. They learn by coaching. They learn by being able to reflect on it. So time is important to be able to reflect on things and then experiment maybe a different way of working. I mean, that's actually the Kolb experiential model, right there. And if these things aren't thought about, then effectively just going AI or technology, you're going to end up with this kind of this half-baked outcome of people really saying, I'm all for change, but then resisting it. And I think that one of the things that we've seen is that, certainly the research out there has kind of pointed to this. And I think it's Gartner have done some research on change resistance and found that, so I think it was 2016, 74% of people were really, up for change. Whereas doing the same kind of survey, I think a couple of years ago, maybe 2022, 2023, it was something like 40%, we'll say. So it's literally almost halved the amount of people who say, yeah, I'm up for change. But the other thing that's accelerated is change is accelerating. So, that same researcher said that change programs per organization is literally 5x the amount of change. So effectively now we've got this kind of less capacity to accept change, more change, and now AI, which is going to drive more and more change. And AI, because it's now machine speed, we humans don't learn at machine speed. We learn at human speed. So it's why I don't like making predictions about the future. I tend to kind of talk about scenarios, because I tend to think that we are, like I said, we are living through the great experiment, and there will be organizations that I think are human-centric and are strategic in their thinking and actually can join strategy to execution and bring people on a journey, and they will win. And the ones who don't will have a rocky road.
Yeah, that was a really valuable perspective. And I believe productivity should not come at the cost of people losing their ability or even the confidence to think critically. And I think technology may become more capable, but organizations still need people who have empathy, and they are the people's champion. So they need people like that. And now, Richard, let's talk about agentic AI. it could reshape entire roles, workflows, accountability structures, and operating models. So, how prepared are most organizations for that level of change?
They're absolutely not.
Okay.
They're not. I mean, look, most of the companies we deal with, like I say, they're in the mid-market. So our target market is private equity and mid-market. So companies within portcos, even enterprises. That we're working with. Well, we have worked with historically in other lives. Some are doing it quite well, but ultimately, there's just this higher order, I think, problem that will probably occur. And that is, if you've got an agent or a bunch of agents focusing on goals and tasks, what's continually changing are the LLMs and the models underpinning them. And for instance, we've written into a statement of work just recently where the work will be designed based on current models and current effort and optimize for token usage or reduce token usage to suit the outcome. But ultimately, if in the future the underlying kind of technology changes and they choose to change the model, for instance, if it's OpenAI, they go to or as I say, it's Claude, they go from Haiku to Sonnet, or Sonnet to Opus, or Opus to Fable, then that'll be treated as a defect. That's really interesting. I find that really interesting because we're human beings, right? You go and do a course and you've just learned something. I would not be turning around saying, Shaheer, you've got a defect. So there's this kind of really interesting kind of paradigm, I think, that's going to be coming up where, the output that an agent might come out with might be absolutely fit for purpose in the time it's delivered. But over time, through usage, through effectively the updating of the context, through the updating of the model, things might start to drift. And it might not drift in a positive way. It might drift in a negative way. So there's this continual kind of upkeep that now has to occur. And I'm sure, look, I'm not the technical guy, so to speak, but I'm sure that there's probably ways to kind of manage that at scale. But at the same time, I look at it and think if everyone has agents, like if just a little thought experiment here, if all companies have got agentic workflows and agents, doing work, where's the random creative spark going to occur? And as everything homogenizes and the cost to serve lowers, how does the organization differentiate between them and someone else? Or, so there's this really kind of, I don't know the answer for it, but there's this really kind of interesting, well, yeah, if everyone's kind of stripping out costs and basically building agentic workflows, and maybe you've just got really now a sales function for person to person kind of B2B selling or whatever it might be, that could be a downward spiral. And I've written on this kind of recently about, software development. Software development is definitely experiencing that cognitive compression and this is why systems integrators in particular, or software developers, that they're able to deliver value in half the time that they would have in the past through using effectively, whether it's an agent or whether it's just a co-pilot to help them code. Yeah, it's definitely speeding it up. But where does it go? Like where does it go from there? If companies then go, right, okay, I've lowered my cost to serve, I've increased my profitability, and the customer then goes, yeah, but you're delivering it half the time, so I don't want to pay as much. Then you kind of your price point goes down. The company's still got to pay for the same kind of direct and indirect costs and the same footprint, So, okay, they might let a couple of people go. Not great for morale or anything like that. You got all those problems. But then, some bright spark comes up with the idea of, I know what we'll do. We'll rather than selling at 150 an hour or 200 an hour or whatever it might be, we'll sell for 90. Now you've got digital labor arbitrage, not just kind of labor arbitrage, which is the model that kind of has existed for years of offshoring to India or Eastern Europe or the Philippines or whatnot, where you got high skilled labor and low cost to serve. So if companies do that and they've now outsourced digital labor arbitrage, and now they're charging bare minimum, and everyone does this, it's a race to the bottom. Like it's just an absolute race to the bottom. They're not actually creating more value. They're just trying to outcompete each other on, what Michael Porter would call a cost leadership position. But cost leadership is not the only strategy available. People will pay for value. Why do people buy Chanel? Chanel handbags and stuff like that? Why do people buy premium goods? There is deeper psychological things going on, like status. So ultimately, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but ultimately I kind of think, again, if companies can think a bit more strategically and not think, short term, quarter to quarter to quarter, then we'll be okay. But I at the same time, I do wonder, particularly about the modern kind of, stock markets, where everything is quarterly this, quarterly that, and driving share prices and share returns. So
I completely agree with that. And also the thing you said, that if every company integrates AI or agentic AI into their systems and things, companies will get homogeneous. And how would a person differentiate between companies? So when you do find an answer to that, do let me know as well.
Imagine a future where everyone's doing the same thing and someone goes, I know, we'll actually have an in-person call center. You would have probably, I reckon, a lot of people going, I can actually talk to a human being. Fantastic. But, for me, it's just because you can automate something or because you can build an agentic workflow doesn't mean you necessarily should. It has to add value to the customer. It has to add value to, effectively, the community, the stakeholders involved, and those stakeholders are also employees.
Yeah. And here's another question I often ask people: who becomes accountable when parts of the workflow are handled autonomously?
The company's still accountable, so that has to be designed. So
Okay.
there are laws now. There are laws in the EU that basically mandate that if you're doing business in the EU, accountability needs to be clearly defined and documented. So there's also EU AI transparency that needs to be communicated, and where AI is being used. So ultimately, I kind of phrase it like this: it's like you're standing in court, and the judge says to you, "Who made that decision?" And you go, "Well, more than me, it was AI." And they go, "Yeah, that's fine, but you're still accountable. So you own the outcome. You own it, no matter And that goes up to the CEO or the owner or whoever's top.
Yeah.
Don't absolve themselves of any responsibility because AI told them so. That is cognitive surrender.
Yeah.
So decision making, judgment of when AI is actually wrong, because it is often completely wrong. And it often doubles down when it's completely wrong until you provided evidence otherwise, and then it will go yes, no, ha. But accountability, defining and designing, accountability through human in the loop, decision making.
It stays with the human.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
IBM said it, right? IBM said that a computer can't own a decision.
Yeah.
That stays with
That's correct. Yeah. So we're just around the end now, and looking back at your experience across technology, consulting, and transformation, what advice would you give to leaders who feel pressured to adopt AI but are still unclear about the problem they're trying to solve?
I'll come back to Professor Bent Flyberg's, one of his principles: think slow to act fast. And I really like that. I actually really like that, right? When I left Australia, I was actually started a PhD at the intersection of human-centered design and agility. And effectively, the simplified answer is human-centered design is design up front. Agility is enough design up front to get to the next increment. So there's already a conflict, right?
Yeah.
So actually, I kind of look at this at the moment and I say, okay, we're living in a world where there's so much noise. There's so many announcements about new this, new that. If you follow anything on YouTube with, these kind of people who are saying, I had sold blah, 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 and put that up against, Fable and which one wins.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. None of that matters. It's just noise. That change that'll continue, and it will accelerate. It will get faster and faster and faster, particularly as AI starts to improve itself. That's already happening. So rather than every kind of, I think it was 9 months or 6 months and a major improvement, it now becomes 3 months. It now becomes 3 weeks. It now becomes 3 days. And that's the logarithmic chart, the hockey stick.
Yeah.
Right? So it's all noise. Ultimately, don't get caught on FOMO, fear of missing out. Think slow, understand the business problems or the opportunities you're trying to address. Don't focus on the technology first, because what I've just described is focusing on the technology first at the beginning. ask the assumptions, look at your business, ask the assumptions. What are the assumptions that underpin our business? Will they hold in a future where, like I say, cognitive work is now more machine than human? So analysis and synthesis, for argument's sake. So consultancies, of which we are one, is going to be one of the most affected, by AI, and that's undeniable. So, where does your competitive advantage come from today? And, which of the underpinning elements within your competitive advantage will AI strengthen or disrupt? Because, like I say, it can strengthen. It might be great for you or might be terrible. Be honest with yourself about, is your organization ready for change? Like, spend time preparing for it, not just treating change as a communication plan and an adoption, plan. That's not change. That's not change management. That's after the fact. Are your benefits defined and tracked? Is your data in a good state? I mean, that's I must be technical there, because if you are going to implement AI on really shoddy data, it's just going to expose many, many things. Is there capacity within your leadership team to absorb the change?
No.
Do people trust the organization? Do they feel valued, or are they passengers? If that's kind of unclear, then I think you've probably got a bit of reflection to do. I just think that we're kind of entering a world where, if you kind of look at it like this, like I said, that the cognitive work is compressing, software developer effort is compressing. What happens in a world where knowledge becomes free, right? And for decades, if not centuries, the thing that we've always sold is knowledge and expertise. In the future, if knowledge, the machine is smarter than the collective or the human, but the machine doesn't actually know how to apply that knowledge, then that's the opportunity, is actually how to have humans and machine work together. And I think that, yeah, it's an exciting time. Where it will go, I personally have my hopes and aspirations, and our little part in it is really to try and steer, our little world within the greater world in what we think is the right direction, which recognizes that this will be a time of massive change, but also a time of massive opportunity if we look at it that way, and we choose to feel vulnerable, be empathetic, help people, upskill, help people move up to Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek world of, everyone becoming smarter. And yeah, that would be awesome.
That is excellent advice and a great point to end the podcast on. Richard, this has been really a valuable conversation. Thank you again for joining me and for sharing your journey and insights with us. I wish you and the Arqvera team continued success. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in to the Founders Instinct. Follow the podcast for more honest conversations with founders, CEOs, and operators about what it really takes to build, lead, and scale companies. Richard, thank you again.
Thank you very much.